Have you ever stopped to think about how incredible antibiotics really are? For most of us, they're just another prescription. You get strep throat, an infected cut, or pneumonia, you take some pills for a week or two, and life goes back to normal. We almost expect antibiotics to work every time. The scary part is that bacteria doesn't stay the same forever. Every time antibiotics are used, bacteria have another chance to adapt. Most of them die, but every now and then a few survive because of random genetic changes. Those survivors reproduce, and before long, you've got bacteria that don't respond to medicines that used to kill them. That is what's called antibiotic resistance. According to you and colleagues in 2023, antimicrobial resistance happens when bacteria and other microorganisms stop responding to drugs that were once effective. That means infections become much harder to treat, leading to longer hospital stays, more severe illnesses, and more deaths. At first, I thought antibiotic resistance was mostly something that doctors dealt with in hospitals. After reading these articles, I realized that it's way bigger than that. It affects medicine, farming, public health, government policy, and honestly, anyone who's ever taken an antibiotic. That's what surprised me the most. One article focused on the science behind resistance and the research that's happening right now. The other article looked at what entire countries are doing to slow down resistance before it gets even worse. Putting those two studies together gave me a much bigger picture than either one by itself. So, what causes antibiotic resistance? One thing that both articles make clear is that antibiotic resistance did not suddenly appear overnight. It's something that humans accidentally helped create. Whenever antibiotics are used too often, prescribed when they aren't necessary or taken incorrectly, bacteria get more opportunities to evolve. Think about it like weeds growing in a yard. If you spray weed killer over and over again, eventually the toughest weeds survive. Those weeds produce seeds, and pretty soon you've got weeds the spray barely affects anymore. So bacteria work in a very similar way, except they reproduce much faster than weeds. You and the other researchers explain that resistance has become a worldwide public health threat because antibiotics are being overused and sometimes misused. They also point out that children are especially vulnerable because they receive antibiotics frequently and their immune systems are still developing. One thing I appreciated about this article is that it didn't just say, use fewer antibiotics. It explained why that's harder than it sounds. Doctors have to balance treating infections quickly while also avoiding unnecessary prescriptions. If they prescribe antibiotics when they aren't needed, resistance increases. But if they wait too long when antibiotics really are necessary, patients can become much sicker. So there's a balance. The bigger picture. The second article takes a completely different approach. Instead of looking mainly at bacteria inside hospitals or patients, Zorlescu and colleagues look at the entire system surrounding antibiotic resistance. They introduce something called the One Health approach. I hadn't heard of this before reading the paper. The basic idea is that human health, animal health, and environmental health are all connected. If antibiotics are overused in livestock, resistant bacteria can spread through food production, water, soil, and eventually people. That's why fighting antibiotic resistance isn't just the responsibility of doctors, veterinarians, farmers, researchers, governments, and even everyday people all play a role. I thought that was one of the biggest differences between the two articles. You et al. Mostly focus on the medical and scientific research happening inside healthcare. So Zorlescu and colleagues zoom out and ask how entire countries can organize themselves to slow resistance before it becomes an even larger problem. So what are scientists doing to slow antibiotic resistance? Once I understood how antibiotic resistance develops, the next question was obvious. What are scientists actually doing about it? The first article by you and colleagues spends a lot of time answering that question. One of the biggest ideas is something called antibiotic stewardship. That's basically making sure antibiotics are used the right way, at the right time, and only when they're actually necessary. At first, I assumed the solution would just be creating stronger antibiotics. The article argues that while new drugs are important, changing how we use the antibiotics we already have is just as important. The researchers discuss several ways that this is happening. Scientists are studying exactly how bacteria become resistant so new drugs can target those weaknesses. They're also looking for entirely new antibacterial compounds, improving the way antibiotics are prescribed to children, and developing better treatments for drug-resistant infections like multi-drug-resistant tuberculosis. One thing I found interesting is that the article doesn't blame antibiotics themselves. Instead, it explains that antibiotics are one of medicine's greatest discoveries, but they're a limited resource. Every unnecessary prescription gives bacteria another chance to adapt. That changed the way I think about taking antibiotics. Looking beyond the hospital. The second article takes those same ideas and applies them on a much larger scale. Instead of focusing mostly on doctors and researchers, Zorlescu and colleagues examine what governments are doing to slow resistance across entire countries. One strategy that they discuss is called surveillance. That might sound boring, but it's actually pretty important. Countries throughout the EU, otherwise known as the European Union, constantly collect information about resistant bacteria. Scientists monitor where resistance is appearing, which bacteria are changing, and whether current policies are actually reducing resistance over time. That information helps governments decide where to focus future research and public health efforts. The article also emphasizes educating doctors, veterinarians, farmers, and the general public. That stood out to me because it's easy to think that antibiotic resistance is only a medical problem. In reality, people outside hospitals have a huge impact too. If antibiotics are overused in livestock, resistant bacteria don't stay on the farm forever. They can spread throughout food, water, and the environment. That's why the One Health approach keeps coming up throughout the paper. The idea is that improving human health means improving animal health and protecting the environment at the exact same time. So where do the two articles agree? Even though that these articles approach the topic differently, they agree on several major points. First, both authors make it clear that antibiotic resistance is a global problem. This isn't something that one hospital or even one country can solve alone. Resistant bacteria doesn't stop at national borders. Secondly, both articles stress responsible antibiotic use. You and colleagues focus on prescribing antibiotics only when they're truly necessary and choosing the most effective treatment instead of automatically using broad-spectrum drugs. Zorlescu and colleagues expand that idea by arguing that responsible use also includes reducing unnecessary antibiotics in agriculture, monitoring antibiotic use across countries, and educating the public about why antibiotics shouldn't be taken for illnesses like the common cold. Finally, both papers agree that research has to continue. Resistance is not something that scientists can solve once and then forget about. Bacteria continue evolving every single day, so medicine has to keep evolving too. So where they differ. The biggest difference between these studies is their perspective. You and colleagues spend more time discussing the science happening inside laboratories and hospitals. They explain resistance mechanisms, new medications, improved dosing for children, and ongoing medical research, while Zorlescu and colleagues hardly focus on individual treatments. Instead, they look at national action plans, government oversight, surveillance programs, and long-term public policy. I actually really like reading them together because one answers the question of how bacteria becomes resistant, while the other answers how societies can respond to that challenge. Neither article tells the whole story by itself. Together, they paint a much more complete picture. What surprised me the most? After reading both articles, the thing that surprised me the most wasn't how dangerous antibiotic resistance has become. I already knew that was a growing problem. What surprised me was how many different people are involved in solving it. Before this project, I pictured scientists in white lab coats trying to invent new antibiotics. That's definitely happening, but it's only a part of the solution. These articles showed that slowing antibiotic resistance also depends on doctors making careful prescribing decisions, veterinarians treating animals responsibly, governments collecting reliable data, researchers developing faster diagnostic tests, and regular people understanding when antibiotics are actually necessary. I realized this isn't just a science problem, it's a teamwork problem. Limitations of the studies. So even though both articles were informative, neither one answered every question. The article by you and colleagues focuses heavily on children and pediatric medicine. It makes sense because it's written about antimicrobial resistance in pediatric infectious diseases, but it means that some of the findings may not apply equally to adults or every healthcare setting. It also summarizes several studies instead of presenting one new experiment, so it gives a broad overview rather than one specific set of results. The article by Zorlescu and colleagues has different limitations. It focuses mainly on antimicrobial resistance programs within the EU. Many of the strategies it discusses could be useful elsewhere, but healthcare systems, funding, and government policies vary from country to country, so what works well in one nation may not be as easy to implement somewhere else. I don't think that these limitations make either article weak. They just remind us that scientific research usually answers one piece of a much larger puzzle. Why this matters. One thing I kept asking myself while reading was, why should someone my age care about this? Right? The answer is actually pretty simple. Antibiotics have been one of the biggest medical breakthroughs in history. They make surgeries safer, help treat infections and after injuries, and protect cancer patients whose immune systems are weakened during treatment, and save millions of lives every year. But if bacteria continue becoming resistant faster than scientists can develop new treatments, routine infections could become much harder to cure. And that's something that could affect every one of us. The encouraging part is that resistance is not completely out of our control. Both articles suggest that smarter antibiotic use, continued scientific research, better monitoring, and stronger cooperation between healthcare professionals and governments can slow the problem down. That gave me a much more optimistic view than I expected. Instead of describing antibiotic resistance as an impossible problem, both studies show that people are already making progress. For future research, if I could ask scientists to keep studying one area, it would be faster ways to identify resistant infections. Several times while reading these articles, I found myself thinking about how much time do doctors lose while waiting for lab results. If researchers can develop faster diagnostic tests, doctors could prescribe the right antibiotic sooner instead of relying on broad-spectrum treatments while they wait for results. I'd also like to see more research on new antibiotics and alternative treatments that bacteria haven't already learned to resist. The more options that doctors have available, the better chance we'll have of staying ahead of resistant bacteria. In conclusion, when I first picked this topic, I honestly thought antibiotic resistance was mostly about bacteria becoming stronger. But after reading these studies, I realized that's only part of the story. The bigger issue is how our own decisions influence what happens next. Scientists are developing new medicine. Researchers are studying how bacteria evolve. Governments are improving surveillance systems. Doctors and veterinarians are working toward more responsible prescribing. Even patients play a role by taking antibiotics only as directed and understanding that antibiotics don't work against viruses like the common cold or the flu. And I think that's the biggest lesson I took away from this project, is that antibiotic resistance is not something that we'll solve with one miracle drug. It's something that we'll manage through better science, smarter healthcare, and better decisions from everyone involved. If those efforts continue, I think there's a very good reason to believe that we can slow antibiotic resistance and protect one of medicine's most valuable tools for future generations. Thank you for listening.